Hello everyone, and welcome to the first edition of the electronic Eremite's Tools of the Trade for Mini Painting. Now this is the very first one I'm doing of these, and part of the reason for doing it is I'm still a novice mini painter myself, and one of the problems I had was with finding the proper tools that would make mini painting easier. When you look at these websites and look at some of the things that people do to paint minis, you wonder, when you're novice like me, how do they do that? How do they get that mini to look so good? How in the world do they make those minis look so professional, even if they may just be novices like myself? Well, one of the things that really helps is having the proper tools. So this edition, I'm going to teach you very briefly, very easily, how to make a wet palette. Now when you hear the word palette, you think of the thing I have before me. A plastic palette for an artist typically has little wells for paints, perhaps a blending or mixing area up here for diluting paints or blending them. This is a nice plastic palette. It's not very big, but for mini painting you don't necessarily need a huge palette. This will cost you just a few dollars. And that will work fine if you're just getting into mini painting and you really want to just do a paint job in one day. The problem is, if you begin to use higher quality mini paints, for example, the much more expensive than your craft acrylic paints like the Reaper Master Series HD paints, specifically for minis. And you will get much better results using a high quality mini paint. But you can see these come in just half-ounce bottles. And you're thinking, well, okay, that means they're not going to last long. No, actually they last quite a long time because you only use just a drop of paint. The problem is that acrylic paint, being a water-based paint, dries very quickly. So when you use these high-quality Reaper-style paints, or even Games Workshop, or other types of paints like the Army Painter paints, you will find that a drop of these will pretty much do you very well for a base coat particularly, but that it will dry so quickly on a traditional palette that it will be wasting a lot of your high quality, more expensive paints. These come in packages of 3 for about $9. You can get a set of them, very good deal, for about $35, and you get 18 to 20 paints. Or you can also just buy them singly. They tend to, depending on the quality of the paint, be anywhere from $2 to $3. So these are not things that you want to dry out and waste. So you want to find a way to stretch out the amount of time that paint lasts. And particularly if you're not a fast painter, if you're going to paint or want to paint several minis, maybe 6 or 7 of an army, you're going to want the paints to be able to not dry up, not get that skin on the top. Anybody who started off will know that acrylic paints tend to get that skin at the top and then make it almost unusable. So what is the way that you can do that? And the best way is through making what is called a wet palette. So allow me to show you what you need. You can make these at home. You can buy wet palettes in an art store, but they will usually run you around $10 to $15, and use a proprietary form of paper so that you will continuously have to buy that paper because it is the paper that fits. Let me show you an easier solution, one that I find works very well, that you can do for about $5, and you can pretty much, any place that you are, you can buy the paper that is necessary to refill it. Let me get you the tools and we'll come right back. The first thing that you're going to need is some form of a Tupperware or closed top container that has a little bit of depth in it because you are going to put water. This is called a wet palette. You're going to need it to be able to be watertight, and it's also going to need something that can seal so that it can be fairly airtight when you want it to be. Particularly if you're going to save the paint you're using until a later time. I find this one, this is a Stairlight Tupperware type container. I bought this at Target. I think it was around $4 to $5. You can certainly find even cheaper. You can go very cheap with this. I, at first, when I first started doing this, used basically a card protector or a card deck holder, anything that has a nice plastic top. Now I found this to be a bit small, so I couldn't get a whole lot of paint on my palette, so I upgraded this to a better container that was larger. So you can see this is about as big as my hand. If you want an even larger one, you can certainly find a bigger plastic tray. I've seen people use all sorts of plastic items for this online, but I like this in particular. It has a nice seal to it. This one's a bit better quality, it's a little harder. You can get those disposable Ziploc brand, but I think this one is a nicer quality. It's going to, for me, last a bit longer, but anything will do. The second piece that you are going to need is some form of a sponge. I like to use a sponge. Some people don't use the sponge. I think I prefer using the sponge because I like how it keeps the water in. And a sponge will last, particularly in an airtight environment. The sponge will keep that water soaked in for quite some time. And particularly if you don't wring out the sponge, which you won't want to do in between while you're doing your painting. This one worked perfectly. This is why I got these two together, because the sponge works perfectly. Now you have to remember, this sponge has been used, so it is dried out. So you want a sponge that is going to fit nice and snug, and so this one looks like it's a little small, but actually when the water goes in, they do expand. So you can't buy a sponge that is too big and hope that it will shrink down. It's not going to do that. Sponges expand. The next thing you're going to need, very easy, very cheap, paper towels. Now, not everybody necessarily uses paper towels, but as the paint is actually going to sit on top of this sponge, and I'll show you how in a second, the sponge is blue, so I like to put a nice little white paper towel down so that the blue of the sponge doesn't show through and change the color of my paint. It usually isn't a big problem, but I also find that the extra absorbency of the paper towel helps to keep the wet palette wet. The last and final ingredient that you're going to need is something called parchment paper used for baking. This is a Reynolds brand parchment paper. You can get a whole bunch of it. Now, the thing that you need to be careful about that it is parchment paper, not wax paper. You do not want this waxed. If it is waxed, it will not work very well. So parchment paper works the best. And this is cheap. You can find it almost anywhere in a Kroger and any sort of goods store like that, Target. You can pretty much buy everything you need just from going to one store. Some people of course the last thing you're going to need is water, and so some people like to use distilled water. I typically don't care about that. People are very worried that the water itself will change the quality of the paint, or the impurities in the water might impact the paint. I have not found this to be true. I have very hard water. Now I do use it through a Brita filter, but it does not get all of the hard water out. Some people like to use distilled water. You can obviously buy distilled water, a gallon, for about $2 in any sort of Kroger, any sort of Target like that. So it's not a huge problem. I don't think that it makes a big difference. Some people are very worried about it, and if for the long quality of your paint you do worry about it, then feel free to use the distilled water. Now what you do is you put your paper towel down, and this is a little too big, but that's fine. It will soak up the water. I like to just sort of put it around. I usually do this in the sink, but since we're taping, you pour the water in. The sponge needs to get good and soaked. I like to even have a little bit of water in the bottom so that make sure the sponge, with this type of deeper Tupperware, you can have water sitting in the bottom that keeps the sponge good and wet and not worry about it coming up over. It's not going to overflow. So that's nice to get a deeper one. If you can't find a deeper one, that's okay. Then you put your parchment paper on top, like so. I like to press it in a little bit, like that. Make sure it gets good and wet on that side. Then you can flip it over. Make sure it soaks in on that side a little bit. Just make sure. See, now you can see that the parchment paper has absorbed a little bit of the water nicely, but it's not like super wet. So if I press on it, I do feel dampness. but I don't get my hands just totally wet. You don't see beads of water on top. That's why I like to flip it over once so that it gets wet on both sides. It makes the absorbency help. Also keeps it flattened down. Sometimes I like to also, before I put it in my wet palette, run a little bit of water on that parchment paper, then shake it off so that the beads of water are off, just so it gets a little more absorbency. You're not looking just for pure wetness here. You're just trying to get a little bit of dampness that comes through the paper. What you'll then do, and I'm not going to do it because I don't have a project ready, is you just put your paint directly onto the wet palette. And you don't have to use a whole lot. This helps in many ways. That paint will stay very much liquid, will not dry very quickly, will certainly not get that skin on top very quickly, and will last a whole lot longer. And if you want to save it over the night, you simply just put your top on, seal it up really tight, and you can save paint throughout the entire night. I've seen people say that it lasts 3 days. Typically, I try to do my painting all in one time, so I don't save it for days and days. But I have certainly saved it throughout the day where I started painting in the morning, needed to leave to go to lunch or whatever, put it in the wet palette, came back, and it was just exactly like I left it. Now the one thing you'll know is because there's a little dampness here, you don't necessarily have to dilute as much when you dilute your paint. It's going to get a little bit of the wetness from here. Now it's not going to get perfect, but it will get a little bit of the wetness from the wet palette. This is still, like I said, I do like to make sure that this gets plenty of water on it. So I might turn it around just one more time. Again, I like to do this in the sink where I can run the parchment paper under the sink a little bit. It's a little harder for me to tape at the sink without getting these electronic equipment damaged. Anyway, there's your wet palette. That's very good right now. That's ready to go. Like I said, deeper so that you can have a little bit of water in the bottom. I could even put a little more water in there if I wanted to. I wouldn't want to pour it on the parchment paper necessarily, but you can see the water will run off the parchment paper. It's only going to sort of soak it in a little bit. It's not trying to make it just purely inundated, but it'll soak it in enough just to have a nice, oh, that's good. That will work perfectly. And it won't dry out as long as I put my top on when I'm not using it. So there's the easy way to extend the life of your palette, to extend the life of your paints. And you will find that once you start using a wet palette, you will not want to go back to the plastic palettes. I occasionally, if I'm using lower quality paints, or I just need a small dot of something and I don't want to, put it on my wet palette, I'm just going to put a little bit of dot of gold or something so I can do buttons. I don't maybe necessarily use the wet palette and I use the plastic palette, but for almost everything else, I'm going to use the wet palette, and it works marvelously. It is a really great way to keep your paints good. You can take your time painting. You're not going to rush and mess things up. You can even, keep some to the side so that well, if I'm going to do a base coat that I'm then going to maybe get some other color on top of it, so I'm going to have to go back over and touch up. It's great because it keeps that other color so you don't have to mix it. And also, it allows for very easy blending. Like I said, there's already a little bit of dampness. So if you put a dot of paint here and a dot of paint here, you can blend those two together without a whole lot extra dilution. Now, you're going to still need to dilute your paints. I think that's painting 101 in a sense. And I'll show you in my next series about some of the different products you can use to help you dilute and to finish off your minis. Anyway, hope you enjoyed that. Hope you enjoyed the tutorial. Very simple, very cheap. That parchment paper you can continue using for a long time. You're not going to run out of it. The sponge can continue using. The one thing you won't want to do is you do need to occasionally rinse out the sponge. You don't want bacteria to grow. That's where your distilled water will be a benefit, is it won't let bacteria and mold grow as much. So you do want to keep that sponge clean, and over time you're going to want to let it dry out, and you're going to want to probably replace the sponge after about a few months of use, so just to make sure that bacteria and mold aren't growing in there and ruining your wet palette. So there you go. Very simple, very easy. Some people don't even use the sponge. Some people just use a nice big pad of paper towel. That's fine too. Give that a shot. See what you like better. Hope you enjoyed it. This is the Electronic Eremite with your Painting Minis Tools of the Trade.